Code Geass Lelouch of the Rebellion is one of the big anime series to air back in the mid-2000s. It was the sort of show that captured a lot of hearts and minds and has really become one of the sort of cultural touchstones of 2000 anime. That said, that was a long time ago. And so it's interesting how much new Code Geass content we've been getting in the last couple of years, considering that the franchise was essentially over with the end of the second season back in 2008. This year saw the release of the long-awaited R3, Code Geass Lelouch of the Resurrection, which was only released in theaters so far. Come on, could we get a DVD for that, yesterday or something? And also a crossover event with the gacha game Granblue Fantasy. And no, this totally isn't getting me hooked on a Cygame's latest money grab or anything like that. What? Seriously though, the Code Geass collab event is actually hella good, and as a fan of the series, I really appreciate the level of detail and character and just how much it feels like Code Geass and how much they bring back. That is really good, and because of all of the Code Geass, I'm taking this time to go back and have a look at the slightly less new but still very new addition to the Code Geass franchise, Code Geass Akito the Exiled. Akito the Exiled is a mid-quel taking place between seasons 1 and 2 of the original series. And while it does share some characters, it's pretty much its own story. Rather than focusing on the continued antics of Lelouch, Suzaku, and the others, they take a back seat to the new characters rather than focusing in, again, on the politics going on between Area 11, aka Japan, and the Britannian Empire. The series is instead focusing in on one part of the EU wars. And as sad as it was to not have Lelouch in the pilot seat anymore, it gave the series a chance to show off how good it was at writing all sorts of characters. What do I mean by that? Well, Lelouch is the character that carries Code Geass. Oh, don't get me wrong, that's not a criticism of the rest of the cast. Suzaku, C2, and Colin, the other members of the main four, are also fabulous characters, and the supporting cast beyond them is littered with a who's who of great secondary characters, from Cornelia, one of my personal favorites, to Lloyd, one of everyone's personal favorites, to the other members of the Black Knights, and the other members of the royal family of Britannia, and Shinkai and the Chinese Federation, and so on and so forth. But Lelouch himself is just such a well-written and such an entertaining character that there are only very few characters in all of anime that can go toe-to-toe with him, and so because of that, he tends to overshadow literally everyone and everything else, especially looking back on the series. So with him out of the way, it gave us a chance to really think about the strength of the secondary character writing and the strength of all of the other characters. Not, again, that this is the same cast, but just the strength of that writing overall. Starting off with our protagonist, Layla. Layla is a really great character. Again, she's no Lelouch, but I found myself really genuinely loving her in her own right. I'd actually like to take a moment to take a look in depth at the scene in which she's introduced. It's one of the best scenes in the entire series for highlighting its incredible character writing, and also does some really clever things for setting up characters and tone. We start off with the mission of this group known as the Wyvern Squad. They seem to be having a great deal of success mowing down enemies behind enemy lines, but at the same time they're also having a ridiculously high fatality rate. The commander of the Wyvern Squad is this general whose name I honestly can't be bothered to remember, and Layla is its second in command. Layla is in the process of having a fight with said commander because said commander has rigged self-destruct sequences to all of the mechs so that when the Nightmare pilots are no longer able to pilot effectively, they are killed along with their adversaries. Layla takes him to task for the fatality rates and points out that he's going to be called out on the carpet for this. He responds that she's the one who came up with this strategy, and therefore it's her fault, and she tells him in no uncertain terms that she won't be held responsible for his changes to her plan. This quick exchange immediately tells us that Layla is a skilled strategist and the reason for the Wyvern Squad's successes, while this incompetent buffoon is the reason that it's had such a high fatality rate, positioning us to like Layla while also giving us a sense for her and her character. Infuriated by this, Lieutenant Colonel What's-His-Face pulls a gun on Layla. And there's a really great moment here where we see the reactions of every single other member of the command center to the fact that Layla is being threatened. So far, we have no reason to think of these characters as anything more than NPCs 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and indeed none of them get any screen time whatsoever as individuals throughout the entirety of the first OVA. But the fact that they each do have their own individualized reactions to this establishes them as individual characters, and sets up the fact that later on they will be getting the development due to them, and the fact that they are people, not just, again, random NPCs. And I thought this was really smart because it primes us to think of them as individuals and primes us to think of the whole scenario world as a world filled with individual people, not with just cardboard cutouts in which the main characters move. And sure enough, by the end of the OVA series, we've gotten to know each of these characters. There's the scientist whose husband has been in a coma for the last 5 years after the scientific advances that the two of them sought for backlashed on him. And there's the drunkard commander who's got a lot more going on with him than seems apparent. And then there's this guy from the guard who we originally think is kind of stiff and stuck up and kind of buying into the racism against the Japanese, or at the very least is got his doubts about them, but over the course of the series becomes more and more of one of Layla and the Wyvern unit supporters, as demonstrated in a great moment later on where the Wyvern unit has this success and everyone starts cheering and he starts cheering right along with them, and then he sort of hastily puts his hand down as though he's realized that he has become emotionally attached without even realizing it. And that's just the tip of the iceberg on what is a really stellar character cast. But back to that opening scene, the encounter ends with Layla doing this. And honestly, after that, you just gotta love her. Beyond Layla, the other main characters are the members of the Wyvern Squad. Most notably, of course, Akito, this series' titular character. While he fits a little bit more into an edgy recluse mold than some of the other characters, his development over the course of the series and his real depth of emotion make him a really likable and enjoyable character, and one I definitely found myself rooting for a lot. Beyond those two, there's also the other three secondary members of the squad, Ayano, Yukiya, and Ryo, all of which are great characters in their own rights, each of whom have their own strong development. I especially like to flag out Yukiya as a really strong, really interesting character who helps the series dive into a lot of its moral arguments. Code Geass has always been an unapologetically political series, calling out the horrors of imperialism and dealing with the issues of minority and disenfranchised individuals. And Akito the Exile is no exception, tackling not so much the direct conflicts between Japan and Britannia, but rather the effects that marginalization has on Japanese people living all over the world. It has a lot to say about refugee society and the treatment of refugees by other nations, and yeah, you don't need me to point out the relevance of those particular topics. Beyond them, there are three other major characters that I really need to touch upon. The first is the antagonist of the series, a Euro-Britannian commander named Shin Hyuga Shane. While I can't really go into details about him without spoilers, what I will say is that he definitely makes this compelling series protagonist, a strategic genius who might not quite be on the level of Lelouch per se, but at least could definitely rival Chinese Federation Shin Kei, and whose ruthlessness is equal to that of Schneisel. And honestly, as a character, I found him far more compelling than any of the series' other major villains, since rather than hyping him up as an absolute evil in the way of Schneisel or Charles de Britannia, he was given the time to be fleshed out as an individual character with his own tragic plotline and complicated emotional baggage. The other two characters who absolutely must be touched upon are the dynamic duo themselves, Suzaku Kururugi and Lelouch v Britannia, or rather should I say Sir Julius Kingsley. Julian Kingsley is the name and identity given to Lelouch by Charles after his initial meeting with him and Geassing at the end of R1. See, at this point it's being revealed that rather than simply dropping him back at Ashford Academy for the entire year between R1 and R2, Charles initially turns Lelouch into Kingsley so that he can use his strategic mind to deal with the EU problems before then turning him to bait for C2 at the end of the OVA series. Funnily enough, despite the fact that these two are the best characters of the main series and honestly stronger characters than any in the new cast, they are also the ones that I have the most criticism for. You see, despite the fact that seeing them was hella enjoyable and that they were as in character as ever, their dynamic was exactly what you'd expect at this part of the series, and their writing was absolutely spot on, they didn't really need to be here. It really did feel like Suzaku and Lelouch were just shoved into this scenario specifically because the writers knew that they were the best things about the main series, and so people were more likely to watch it if there were Suzaku and Lelouch moments. And that's fine, like, don't get me wrong, I totally subscribe to that, I totally enjoyed seeing them there, and it is part of the reason I picked up Akito the Exiled to begin with, but it was also kind of annoying because they were just relegated to minor characters whose actions really didn't change much of anything throughout the series. They themselves couldn't really go through any development or evolution since there was already a canonical path for their development from R1 to R2, but I do have to say that I was disappointed that after going to all the trouble to include them in the series, they didn't even get to have much effect on the Akito the Exile original cast either. Speaking of that cast, you may have noticed that we are most of the way through this review and that's really all I've talked about, and there's a reason for that, which is that the characters are the reason to be watching this series. Now don't get me wrong, the plot is interesting. I liked a lot of the moral messiness of this, compared to the original Code Geass especially. In R1 we are presented with two decisive sides, the Britannians, evil, and the Japanese, good. Now, not all Britannians are evil, as presented to us both by the Special Envoy Engineering Corps and the students of Ashford Academy, but the only Britannian with actual political power who wasn't a villain or antagonist was Yufian, as she was just one person without her own faction, but didn't provide us with any political messiness. And on the other side, sure, there were a few fractions between the Japanese, mainly those between the JLF and Black Knights, but those were quickly squared away and never became a full force of focus for the series. Over the entire series, the only time when we had more than 3 factions in any given time was the fighting in the Chinese Federation, where we had the Britannians led by Prince Schneisel, the Black Knights led by Lelouch, and then the two sides of the Chinese Federation as represented by the High Eunuchs and Shinkei, respectively. Akito the Exile, however, presents us with something very different. There is, of course, the EU and Britannia, but the EU has its own corruption going on, and its own conflicts as mostly represented by General Smilis. Beyond that, though, there's Euro-Britannia, a nation that is semi-autonomous but existing within the Britannian sphere. Basically, it's the European nations that have already been conquered back by Britannia and are allowed to exist in a state that is semi-separate from the rest of the Britannian Empire, which is directly under Charles' control. Euro-Britannia has 4 holy orders, and each of its orders have its own commanders, and they each have their own agendas, and while most of them fall into line, 1 or 2 definitely do not. And of course, there's their relationship between them and the Britannian Empire, as well as the relationship between individual knights with their own factions, such as Lord Ashley, who's another character who I thought was really interesting and developed well over the course of the series. But the point is that there's a lot going on, and that there's no one single ultimate good to root for. That is, sure, the Wyvern Squad are the quote-unquote good guys, but they are a series of individuals made up into a singular unit, not a full political faction the way the Black Knights were, meaning that who they serve and what they're doing is not necessarily aligned with the greatest good because, of course, again, they're not the ones in control, they're just soldiers taking orders. The room for moral ambiguity and individual motivation within this much messier playing field was something I definitely got into, as was the more supernatural parts of the series because, of course, this is Code Geass, so yes, there are code bearers and Geass users, and some allusions to C's World. But that's where the main flaw of the series comes in. There's some stuff that isn't really explained, not fully at least, with Geass and C's World and supernatural stuff, and even with the political threads, there's some stuff that's not super gone into. Because at the end of the day, the characters are the focus, and yeah, I could sit here picking through all of the teeny holes in the series, but even though I noticed some of them while I was watching it, they never bothered me because it was the characters that I was invested in, and it is on the strength of their writing that the series really stands. To sum up, is Akito the Exile a flawless series? No. Is it on par with the initial Code Geass? No. But, while I went in mainly expecting to enjoy the moments when Lelouch and Suzaku were on screen, I ended up finding myself genuinely falling in love with the entire new character cast and really enjoying the series for what it is as a standalone work. And so I encourage anyone who's on the fence of going into it, especially learning that Suzaku and Lelouch are such minor characters, to go ahead and give it a try. It really, truly is an enjoyable piece of entertainment, one that I wish more people were talking about, and because of that, and on the strength of its character rating, I'm going to go ahead and give it a rating out of 4 out of 5 possible stars. It's definitely earned it. For alternate anime recommendations, the first and most obvious thing that comes to mind is if you're interested in the messy political environment that's introduced in this series, as well as an old series with updated pretty animation and CGI that's way better than the CGI nightmares this has, I point you first and foremost to Legend of the Galactic Heroes di Noia Tesa. If you're looking for another series in the same vein with equally as good, or may I say it, even better character writing, I point you toward Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. And if you just missed Illusion won another series with a scheming, manipulative protagonist with the power of a god, I'm going to point you toward the saga of Tanya the Evil. Revisiting Code Geass after all these years has actually been really fun for me, so if you'd like to hear me talk more about the series, please leave me a like or let me know down in the comments. This is Coriander Stone, and I thank you for watching. El Sai Kangru.